Northwest Now is supported, in part, by viewers like you. Thank you.
Would you be surprised to hear about an anarchist colony on the Key Peninsula?
A group of people that society at large is often viewed as terrorists.
Are you surprised their pet political issues are at the forefront today?
Especially the people at home. We're dealing with issues that the rest of the nation was going to come and deal with later.
Can you imagine a nude bathing scandal bringing it all to an end?
It was like a bomb that fractured the community.
The story of Home, Washington on this edition of Northwest Now.
We're pretty normal, and nobody has done any nude bathing at all, as far as I know.
Driving south on the Key Peninsula Highway, you might just miss the little sign marking the village of Home. Looking across from the southern shore of present-day Von Geldern Cove, Home really isn't remarkable in any way. But in 1896, the inlet was called Joe's Bay, and the shoreline where Home now sits was the landing spot for 3 refugee families, all fresh from a failed socialist colony outside of present-day Eatonville called Glennis.
It had shown them what they didn't want.
Justin Wadland is the author of the book, Trying Home.
And the responsibilities were divvied up, but they found that there were too many rules and that some people did all of the work and others did none of the work. So they wanted to go to the other extreme and yet still have a utopian vision.
That vision was anarchism, but not the bomb-throwing anarchy of the day that had the rest of the country so afraid. Rather, it was the political philosophy, anarchism, that promoted no government, free thinking, absolute personal liberty, and free speech. But it was an 1898 article in a Tacoma newspaper that first broached the term anarchy in relation to Home when describing the colony's landholding scheme, where there was no ownership, just 2-acre plots belonging to an association. Thanks to the article, the term anarchy was a label that would forever stick to the people living in Home, making no distinction between violence and the more subtle political philosophy of anarchism that Home wound up embracing, perhaps reacting to the article.
I don't know if they identified themselves as anarchists until that happened, but then when they did that, yeah, I mean, there was a particular consequence that happened as a result of that, in that, to be an anarchist in the late 19th century, early 20th century was essentially allying yourself with a group of people that society at large often viewed as terrorists.
The residents of Home were reacting to change. The dawn of the 20th century brought a rethinking of the social order, and the issues sure sound familiar. There was a staggering gap between rich and poor, market crashes, severe unemployment, the constant threat of war, and rapid technological change. It resulted in serious social unrest, and the Puget Sound became a faraway haven for freethinkers and radicals, resulting in more than a half-dozen experimental colonies, including Home.
And so there was a whole mass of these things and a rise in feelings about socialism, that perhaps we should move toward a form of socialism, the government taking over everything. And on the other hand, some people going more toward anarchism, less and less government. And so there was this whole multitude of issues and problems. And for some people, the solution seemed to be, let's establish some small groups of people living and cooperating together and working together, getting along with each other. And maybe that is the way to the best life, the best kind of society.
Lila Luganville is the great-granddaughter of George and Sylvia Allen, one of Home's 4 founding families. She spent childhood summers in Home, visiting her grandmother.
This was heaven to me. I remember next door climbing, there was a big old cherry tree, a big cherry tree, and we would climb up and sit on her roof in the sun and pick cherries and look out over the bay, and I thought I would just love to live here. Never really thinking that I would ever have the opportunity to.
Luganville now lives on the waterfront in Home in a house next door to her grandmother's old place. Although far removed from her ancestors' more radical past, the story of what Home was meant to be was passed down, and she says that free-thinking vibe is still a part of life here.
It was an intentional community set up to make it possible for people to have freedom, but yet not step on each other's toes. It wasn't socialism, it was just kind of what you would dream of as a utopian community. That's the name for it. People would help each other if they needed help, but otherwise you sort of live and let live. And it's ideal in that respect. And it is still a little bit that way here. We have friends all up and down the waterfront, and we all are fairly free thinkers. Very few of us are religious. And kind of the old home feel is still here.
By 1901, nearly 100 people lived in Home: free thinkers, free lovers, vegetarians, atheists, New Age spiritualists, and every other brand of what would be labeled the counterculture in 1965, and perhaps what we'd call today elements of the progressive and alternative communities. But it wasn't all politics, publishing, and subsistence farming.
After they had established themselves, it seems that they did have a fair amount of leisure time because they had lots of activities in Home. Poetry readings, tons of talks, singing, bands. They would go on trips. So it must have allowed them enough time to do that.
But the people of Home's passion was politics and debate, and Liberty Hall was where nationally known anarchists like Emma Goldman and a parade of others would spend hours debating the disparity of wealth, the rule of the corporations, the corruption of the political process, workers' rights, reproductive rights, and minimum wage, all then, just as now. Author Charles LeWarn says his now 30-year-old book, Utopias on Puget Sound, started as a look at history, but now may be a look at how future waves of social experiments might spring forth from our current social displacements and divisions.
I felt I had been dealing with a group of people that had lived well in the past, that, this would not happen again. But by the time the book was published, we were into the late 60s and the 70s, and the countercultural revolution that took place, and the same thing was happening over again. So who's not to say that that could occur?
The ideas that they had didn't often originate in Home, but what was unique about Home is that they were willing to take those ideas, these radical ideas, and apply them to themselves and live by them. So, for whatever reason, they were able to identify the ones that were ahead of their time.
That forward-thinking mindset perhaps reinforced an attractive idea. The idea that beyond living the communitarian ideal, the people of Home had intellectual capital to share with the rest of the world too.
We have all these little back waterways and bays, and then essentially you go off in Puget Sound, you find some peninsula, you have the trees behind you, the water in front of you. You can almost imagine that you're there by yourself, a city on the hill ready to offer an example to the rest of the country.
And the rest of the country got to know Home through a series of 5 strongly voiced alternative self-published newspapers, including The Agitator and Discontent. It was how just about all of the region's experimental colonies got their propaganda out.
And so these newspapers did circulate, and that was a very important use of media. And if you had something published maybe in your newspaper, it might be picked up by a number of the others. And so this was a way of circulation. It wasn't quite as rapid as we are accustomed to, but it did exist.
While publishing was arguably Home's most important ideological exercise, the attention would later bring plenty of trouble. Evelyn Evans descends from one of Home's earliest families. She's the granddaughter of Martin Dadisman, who bought and donated 64 additional acres to the Home Association's original 26. Evans says the story is that her grandfather was rejected back east for his relatively progressive views on race.
And he was kind of a person that was an individual that didn't go along with all the rules. And I think the thing was, he hired colored folks in Virginia to work for him, and the neighbors were not happy about that. So he moved, and he eventually came to Home. He must have read about it or heard about it, but eventually he came to Home.
Like many of the descendants of Home's early residents, Evans says her father was not a part of Home's anarchist culture, but was just the shopkeeper at the town's collective store, where she grew up in 2 attached rooms. These days, the shoring from the buildings and wharfs on the old waterfront barely stand. But Evans says the Puget Sound's many ferries and boats, known as the Mosquito Fleet, kept Home plugged into the rest of the world.
And so we didn't feel like we didn't feel isolated, because the boat came every day, and my mother would go into town and shop and into Tacoma, and I went in for piano lessons. My dad thought I would be a great pianist. He hoped.
Evans didn't go on to do much with the piano, but she lived a full life recorded in her memoir. And at the time of this interview, in August of 2014, at the age of 94, she was thought to be the oldest living native of Home. Home sure doesn't look like a 60s-era commune, but the idea of free love was espoused here in the early 1900s. While the Tacoma papers sensationalized free love, the free thinkers in Home were really talking about women's rights, whether marriage worked, and at the least, letting marriage result from mutual affection rather than duty or arrangement.
During this Victorian era, women in particular didn't have a lot of freedom about who they could marry, whether they would marry. They couldn't, there weren't a lot of job opportunities. So in that sense, it was really they were putting forth a modern idea of marriage, which was that the marriage should be based on love, freely chosen.
But newspaper articles questioning the institution of marriage using the language of free love got Home's newspaper publishers into a lot of hot water. In 1900, discontent publisher Charles Gauvin violated one of the era's many morality laws and was promptly fined $100 and told to quit printing what was characterized as obscenity. And the free love ideal would soon come back to bite Home again as the linchpin for further prosecutions in the wake of the assassination of President William McKinley in September of 1901.
During the heyday of Home, there was the anarchist who killed President McKinley. There had been other assassinations, there had been bomb throwers and buildings destroyed, and there was a real fear of anarchism. And so they were seen as violent people. Now the folks that came to Home said no.
They may have said no to violence, but nobody cared to hear it after the McKinley assassination. The relatively light treatment Home received in the press evaporated, and then quickly escalated all the way to calls for outright murder and extermination.
There is this tendency when some sort of trauma happens, whether it's economic, political, to somehow identify an other and say, we want you out of here. This is like they're the scapegoat for this, rather than maybe looking at ourselves, being more reflective.
The calls for the blood of Home grew so shrill, a collection of Civil War veterans calling themselves the Loyal League actually set out by boat to cut Home down. But Captain Ed Lorenz, who got to know the people of Home well over the years, got wind of the plot. And as he nudged his boat Ticonda into Commencement Bay, the boat was suddenly beset by engine trouble he manufactured, forcing him to return the boat and the angry mob with tickets refunded to Tacoma. At least that's the story.
It is a good one. And I think it represents the collective memory of home. They felt that there was a real potential for violence. And I think they knew that. And in some ways that feeling, I think, is what morphed into the story.
While the self-styled patriots never got to outright murder in home, they were able to leverage the era's rigid morality laws, many of which were directly pointed at those who dared espouse radical ideas in writing, or that were distributed to others through the mail. With the law on their side and emotions still running hot from the McKinley assassination, there was a new round of arrests and trials for those associated with writing, publishing, and distributing Home's newspaper, Discontent. And it turns out postal officials were holding and hiding the paper and fixing to take away Home's post office to boot.
The last issue of Discontent that was on the microfilm reel that I looked at talked about how they learned that they're going to close the post office, and that in the next issue they're going to give it a full accounting of what happened, but I never was able to see that next issue.
Home's post office was closed in April of 1902. It wasn't until 1958 that Home got a post office again, but even now, it's still called the Lake Bay office. In 1908, for reasons still unknown, the residents of Home changed the landholding scheme. Parcels were now private property, and it laid the groundwork for new blood to buy into Home. People with no interest necessarily in the colony's free-thinking and anarchist founding principles.
So anybody could move to Home now. And it was a nice place to live. I mean, what they said is that, it was an inexpensive place to live. And so people started to move in who didn't share the original founders' vision of the community. So I don't think it's a coincidence that there was that change, and then 3 years later, suddenly this factionalism appears over nude bathing.
Many residents thought nothing of wearing their birthday suits for dips into Joe's Bay. The colony was remote. Nobody cared.
I think they were modest about it. It wasn't that they were all nudists. I mean, that's one of the misconceptions I get sometimes. Oh, those people of Home were nudists. They weren't nudists. They were nude bathers.
But some of the new townspeople were in an uproar, complaining to law enforcement as they also deliberately made their way to the shores of Joe's Bay to be offended. It all came to a head when Jay Fox, the publisher of Home's last alternative newspaper, The Agitator, wrote an explosive article called The Nude and the Prudes.
It was like a bomb that fractured the community. He and essentially created these factions between the nudes and the prudes. The nudes were not nude bathers. They were the people who were standing up for the principles that Home represented, the freedom, individualism. And the prudes were the ones who were busybodies, trying to get involved in other people's affairs.
Agitator publisher Jay Fox survived being shot in labor strife in Chicago and was an early proponent of an 8-hour workday, a free press, free speech, women's rights, but he was eventually put on trial in Tacoma for his article about nude bathing.
And he was found guilty, and then the decision was appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's really interesting who upheld that decision, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who later in the 1920s would author landmark free speech decisions, ones that are quoted that essentially present a modern conception of free speech. His ideas in those decisions are very similar to the ones that Jay Fox was making when he was arguing in favor of free speech.
Fox served a short jail term, tried another newspaper in Chicago that failed, and returned to speak and write until he died on the south side of Holmes Little Inlet in 1961. The Key Peninsula Historical Society is where some of the artifacts from Home now reside. Inside, we learn about Home's egg candling industry. Here too, though, the importance of Home's publishing efforts is highlighted, and Jay Fox's The Nude and the Prudes article is what brought national attention to Home.
But it was funny because they were known more outside of this area across the United States than they were, by the people in Long Branch or Lake Bay or Vaughan, because of lack of roads, and even though they were close proximity, a mile or two apart from each other.
At the time of the nude and prudes controversy in Home, the Burns Detective Agency was deep into its ongoing investigation into the 1910 labor-related bombing of the LA Times building. One of the children of Home, Donald Vose, was hired by Burns as a mole into the anarchist movement as part of a nationwide hunt for the bombers and their associates.
Most of the children of Home went on to be very successful, but he was one who really rejected his parents' values and essentially used his mother's contacts in the anarchist circles to track down suspects in this bombing.
Vose got information that led to the arrests of 2 of the bombers' associates, but he remains persona non grata in the history of Home for betraying his mother Gertie's relationships with people like Emma Goldman. By 1919, still stinging from the Donald Vose betrayal and the nude and prudes debate, the grand experiment at Home unraveled. It was all-out legal war in the courthouses of Pierce County between Home's landowners, founders, business people, and residents.
Yeah, it was as if, during the nude and the prude episode that they got used to this contentious infighting, and that continued onward into this episode, and they needed to rely on the courts to put an end to it.
There was a lot of outside pressure on Home, but it was not the outside pressure ever that broke them up, in my view. It was all internal issues, and that is true of many of these communal groups.
Liberty Hall used to stand right up on the hill. It was torched, and the original idea of Home finally died in 1919 when what was left of the association was dissolved by a judge and the attorneys walked away with the colony's last $2,300. In the decades since, there have been stories about the 60s and 70s maybe getting a little wild, but all in all, Home just became another development right here on the shores of Puget Sound. But the colony's biggest impact may lie more in the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of Home. Author Chuck LeWarn says they include people like renowned Tacoma photographer Verna Hafer, Northwest Horticultural Council past president Ernest Falk, and Stanford University organ transplant pioneer Rose Payne. None had direct contact with the original experiment, of course, but perhaps like many of the other teachers and professionals produced by modern-day Home, they benefited from long-standing family traditions of discussion and intellectual curiosity.
I think education in the formal sense may have had an effect, but I think the far greater effect was the general atmosphere and being exposed to people always talking about things and arguing about things. A lot of the children talked about the bookshelves and the kinds of things that people were reading. I think it was probably that atmosphere more than the formal training that they had.
And to some degree, Home and other utopian experiments informed today's progressive culture in the Pacific Northwest. Not directly, of course, but by being tentpole expressions of the region's progressive intellectual tradition for those who care to seek it out.
That history, I mean, the people who are sympathetic to the history of Home, but also the larger sort of radical history of the Pacific Northwest, which includes wobblies, socialists, communists, anarchists, people know of this history.
And I think that there were people that came out of these groups that played a role in journalism, a role in politics, that did have an influence in the liberal atmosphere, at least of a few generations ago, and probably lingering today.
So if the legacies of Home are some faded memories and children and grandchildren who went on to do pretty well in some cases, what is the takeaway for today?
I don't think the relevance is anarchism in the sense that they talked about it or the black-hooded people talk about it today, but I think it was this curiosity and this thought that we need to be examining things and thinking about things and thinking toward the future. I think that would be the major takeaway from Home.
Utopia really challenges the idea of what human society is, and that it's created by our own participation in it. And if there aren't enough people to participate in it, or if enough people want to do something different, then there will be change.
I hope this program got you thinking and talking. To watch this program again or to share it with others, it streams on our website at kbtc.org. That's where you'll also see more information about where to find Justin Wadlin's book, Trying Home, and Chuck LeWarn's book, Utopias on Puget Sound. Thanks for taking a closer look on this edition of Northwest Now. Until next time, from Home Washington, I'm Tom Layson. Thanks for watching.